All right, nice to see you. Todd Candelon here. Missed you last week. In case you're wondering why I missed a week, that'll happen from time to time. I'm a television producer by day and an online preacher by night, and sometimes my schedule gets crazy. Typically, I'm shooting once a month right now on one of the key series that I produce, and that just means that that week just gets out of control. And so sometimes what I do is I work in advance and I get my sermon for that week done early. In fact, I shoot two the same week so that the shoot week I don't have to worry about it. But last week was one of those weeks where I dropped the ball and wasn't prepared enough in advance, and so that is the reason why. So that said, without further ado, we're going to jump right into week 10 in my ongoing exploration of the Gospel of Mark. If you've just kind of joined this series right now, on toddcandelon.com you can find the previous sermons in the series as well as a whole bunch of other ones. There's about 250 sermons, maybe 260 by now, in the archives section of that site, and most of those are audio files from the last church I pastored, but all of the recent work I've been doing online, you can also find the YouTube links there on the archives page. The thing with this Mark study is we're looking to study the life of Jesus, who he was, what he said, what he did, and what that means for us. That's why we're calling it the Christ-centered life. This week we find ourselves still in Mark chapter 2, and we're focusing specifically on verses 23 to 28. So let's read them. As usual, I work out of the New King James Version. You see the text here on the whiteboard behind me. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." Getting right to it in verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Now it happened that he went. Simple point, just want to highlight the fact that we're following Jesus here. It's not a mistake that we call this sermon series the Christ-centered life. The Gospels of Jesus are about Jesus. As Christians, we are seeking to learn to follow Jesus. This should be, if you're a Christian, your daily preoccupation, figuring out how can I follow Jesus today. And this is not just a concept that you think about when you wake up and then you don't think about again for the rest of the day, but moment by moment throughout your day, you should be thinking almost intuitively, like you should get to the point where you're not even having to work at it really anymore. You are just mindful of who Jesus is. You're mindful of what he said, did, and taught, and you're learning to apply what that means to the way in which you function moment by moment. You'll find, as you follow Jesus, your conscience will begin to help you. As you begin to learn more and more about who Jesus is, what he said, and what he did, and what that means, you'll find that when you get into a situation where you're about to do something you shouldn't, that you just get the charismatics call it a check in your spirit. You might feel like gut rot to you or pain in your chest. You just get that sense that you really shouldn't be doing this. Sometimes when I was younger and I'd find myself in a situation where I was being tempted to carry on in a way in which I knew I shouldn't, I'd actually feel my temperature drop. I'd actually get cold, almost like a fight or flight response. If you ever find yourself in a near car accident or in a really intense confrontation with somebody else, you know that feeling I'm talking about. It's brought on by all the blood kind of rushing to your core. It's your body getting ready to fight for its life. You'll find sometimes when you're dealing with sin, temptation, and struggle that you'll feel that way. That is your conscience responding to God the Holy Spirit's prompting that you should maybe move on and keep on trucking. So become sensitive to that sense, aware of that work of your conscience. As you begin to follow Jesus, you'll find that that's applicable throughout your day, moment by moment. So now it happened as he went. So just keep in mind that we are following Jesus. The other question for you is, of course, who are you following? If you're not following Jesus, who are you following? And how's that working out for you? The other thing I want to say is that it's important for us that we give each other some grace as we follow Jesus, meaning it's important for us not to be hyper-legalistic. In this whole recent section in the Gospel of Mark, he's pushing back against some of the objections of the Pharisees to his work and the way in which he does his work and the way in which his disciples are responding to his work. The Pharisees were the religious elite of the day. Many of them would have been more than just religiously elite. They would have been the upper echelon of Jewish society. Not all of them, but most of them would have been a little more up there than the average Joe, more highly educated, most of them from families that could afford the education. So this is the upper crust, and they are kind of butting heads with Jesus here in the last few sermons. So they are kind of our example here of what not to do. We're going to get to them in a minute. The Pharisees right here show up. They were legalists, not known as the most gracious of characters. But that is something, if we're honest, that you and I are also guilty of. Now here's where I get to the whole grace idea, that as we follow Jesus, we need to cut ourselves and others some slack. Why is that? Well, because the scriptures themselves aren't very legalistic. Now, it happened as he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Now, if you look at that passage in the original language, it actually says cornfields. So if you really want to be a stickler, you should be raising an objection here. Well, is it grain fields or cornfields, Todd? The Bible is inerrant, isn't it? So which is it? Is it grain? This is an example of the Bible having errors, right? Is it grain fields or cornfields? It doesn't really matter. Okay, here's the lesson for us. Some details matter, some details don't. Okay, so make sure that you cut yourself some slack as you follow Jesus. And most importantly, make sure that you don't become one of these people who's parsing the details to the point that it begins to make your peers feel inadequate, feel judged, feel looked down upon. I'm not saying there is no such thing as judgment. God is judge, and he will judge us all, thankfully, in light of the accomplished work of Christ on our behalf. But we are not to stand in judgment over one another in such a way so as to be looking down our noses at each other, thinking, I'm better than you, you miserable wretch. If only you were more like me, your life would be a better place. Okay? Cut each other some slack as you learn to follow Jesus, because even here in this portion of Scripture, there's a little bit of slack in terms of how the language is applied. And when it comes to figuring out which details matter and which details don't, it's along the journey that you figure out which is which. Look at verse 23 again. Now, as it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went. So Jesus is wandering through the fields, and his disciples are too. Now, it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, so all of a sudden now it's not Jesus, it's Jesus and someone else. And then right here, it tells us who that someone else is, the disciples. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. So he's not by himself, he's got his homies with him. It's important here to note that they're just on a Sabbath walk, okay? They're walking on the Sabbath. They're heading from point A to point B. They are traveling somewhere as they went. It's along the journey that you and I are going to figure out which details matter and which details don't. Now, you need to keep in mind here that Israel at the time would have been nearly 100% agrarian. I grew up in Israel, and even as a boy there in the 80s, you don't have to walk far outside of the city limits to find yourself in what are basically farmers' fields, or at the very least, pasture land for the grazing of sheep. So at the time, Israel would have been highly, highly agrarian. You couldn't walk a mile without crossing a field. It's important here to note that they are not out looking for trouble. Let's look again at verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. So they're just on a Saturday walk, okay? So they're on the journey. They're not looking for trouble. I just want to point out that there's a difference between being on the journey and making a few mistakes along the way, which all of us do, and intentionally seeking to stir up trouble. This whole sequence here, as I said before, is dealing with the Pharisees. It's dealing with the religious elite who are always complaining about what Jesus does, how he does it, and how his followers respond to his lead. Sadly, this is still the case today. Most of you will have bumped into somebody in a church who is unhappy about something the pastor is doing and the way in which the people in that church are applying the way in which that pastor is teaching from Scripture. Exhibit A. So there's a difference between just being on the journey and doing something that perhaps is a mistake and intentionally seeking to stir up trouble. Here, the disciples, they're just out doing something totally normal. They're moving from point A to point B. They're on a walk. They're maybe heading somewhere for Jesus to continue his ministry, and they begin plucking heads of grain. You'll see why that's a problem in just a minute. Also, I want to note that it's his disciples who end up getting into trouble, not Jesus. Okay, it's usually us who cause the trouble. His disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. I wanted to remind you, I was reminded as I worked through this, that you and I are, in some cases, with some people, the only Christianity they're ever going to see. Right? People will have a preconceived notion about what Christianity is, what it stands for, but in reality, their experience of what Christianity means is very likely to be embodied by you. It should be a sobering thought. Not something to make you paranoid or to feel guilty, but rather a reminder. This is true in my life. I carry myself, even with my neighbors. I do my best to treat them in such a way that honors Christ. Does that mean I never make a mistake? Well, of course not. I'm a disciple on a Saturday walk, and sometimes I do the wrong thing. But it's important for us as followers of Christ to keep in mind that we represent Christ and everything that he stands for to the people around us. So just keep that in mind. There's also a very interesting life lesson here. They begin to pluck the heads of grain. So I better tell you why that's a problem. It's the Sabbath, right? So they're walking on the Sabbath, and it's very clear in Judaism that Saturday, Sabbath, the seventh day, is a day of rest. You are not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. Okay, so any good Jew would know this. And the Pharisees here, they're being really particular because most Jews would have known that Deuteronomy 23:25 says that it's okay when you're wandering through a field to pluck the heads of grain. But they would say, not on the Sabbath, right? No work of any kind. Sabbath was a day of rest. Saturday was a day that you were meant to take off from your usual toil and relax a little bit. Here's the life lesson for us. Now, I'm stretching the interpretation here just a little bit. They're plucking the heads of grain. In Deuteronomy, it says it's okay when you wander through your neighbor's field to pluck the heads of grain, but it's not okay to go through your neighbor's field with a sickle. So the point there was that if you're on a journey and you get hungry, you're going to end up at some point walking through a grain field. So it's okay to pluck a few heads of grain off. You'd break them open and you would eat the seed as kind of a snack along the way. It's okay to snack along the way. It's not okay to turn that into your harvest field. Here's the bit of the stretch for us. Just remember the word snack, okay? These heads of grain, they're not stopping along the way to have a banquet or a feast, okay? It's just a snack. The implication here is that we need to remember to travel light. Okay, the point for the Christian is to keep going, is to stay on the journey. The point is to get to where God's leading you. So do whatever it takes to keep going. If that means just snacking along the way, then just snack along the way. Travel light. God will provide the snacks that you need along the way. This will help us with our expectations of life. If you're expecting to be stopping along the way for lavish banquet after lavish banquet, you may find yourself disappointed with all that following Jesus actually means. However, if you take your cue from this and remember the fact that God promises us the snacks we need to keep going, that's going to make your life a whole lot more enjoyable because you'll be managing your expectations. So this is what's happening. They're walking with Jesus through a field. They're plucking some heads of grain. They're eating the heads of grain along the way. The Pharisees see it, and they are not happy about it. So here we are. And the Pharisees, verse 24, and the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" These guys are breaking the Sabbath. These guys are working on a Saturday. I wanted to point something out. This might be obvious to you. I've been able to interview in my TV career several high-profile atheists. I've been on television shows where I'm on a round table. I'm kind of the token Christian, and they always surround me with the opposite of the token Christian, and there's always an angry atheist on the panel. And I've noticed over doing this for like 20 years now, I've never yet met a really happy-go-lucky atheist. Now, you may be the exception, but I'm just saying, honestly, this is not like a line to try and be provocative here. I've just honestly never met a really happy-go-lucky atheist. And here's where it gets sweet. I've also never met a really happy-go-lucky religious church person. You notice that religious church people tend to be really uptight. They tend to be poorly dressed or dressed like they're a relic from the 1950s. They tend to wag their finger a lot and scowl, right? Like, when was the last time you met a really happy-go-lucky religious church person? It's just funny that those two cats who shouldn't have much in common actually do. Look, why are your guys doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? To this day in Israel, growing up as a boy, if we happened into the wrong neighborhood in Jerusalem on a Saturday, the ultra-Orthodox Jews from those neighborhoods would berate us, sometimes throw things at us. To this day, if you wander into Mea Shearim, well, you don't go into Mea Shearim, but anywhere near Mea Shearim, which is kind of the ultimate ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem, they'll throw stuff at you and they'll shout, Shabbos, 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 Shabbos. It's Saturday, it's Saturday. You know, don't disrespect the Sabbath. Shabbos, Shabbos. So they're pretty paranoid about making sure that they, and you, even if you're a goy like me, don't transgress the Sabbath. So don't do any work. That's out of Exodus 20, verses 9 to 11. Your people are breaking the rules. I think it's suffice it to say that Jesus isn't very big on rules. You'll see why. Let's look here at verses 25 to 26. But he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him? Don't you remember this story, says Jesus? A few very interesting things about this. First of all, have you never read what David did? He's referring here, of course, to King David, the greatest human king in Jewish history. So he is comparing himself to King David, therefore the Son of Man. So he's comparing himself to King David, which is fairly audacious. He's in the habit, Jesus is, with these Pharisees of building the case that he's God in a body and that they should stop haranguing him and begin listening to him. The point here for you and I is simple. Jesus is king. Don't forget it. Okay, he gets to call the shots. He's in charge. He does what he wants. Our job is to not tell him what to do, but to follow him. I am the king, says Jesus. So he compares himself to King David. Have you not heard what King David did? It's also interesting here how he says that when David was in need and was hungry. When he was in need and hungry. This is one of those temporal interpretation moments, kind of typically Todd Candle on here. This is comforting to me. If even King David, one of the great biblical heroes, can find himself in need and hungry, so can you and I, right? We tend to think that these people who inhabit the pages of the Bible are somehow supermen and superwomen. They're not. They're men and women who need to eat. In the case of King David, they're men who lust after their neighbor's wife and, in fact, kill the neighbor so they can take the wife. I love that a man after God's own heart was guilty of such things. And I feel bad for King David, because if I was to be featured in the books of the Bible, the story about me wouldn't be that peachy either. So, if one of the great heroes of Scripture can find himself in need and hungry, so can you. It's also really cool here to see that Jesus is painting in broad strokes. This is a really important point. How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest. So he's here referring to a story that's recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Only problem is there's a few things about it that aren't exact. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, the priest in question is actually Ahimelech. So you should be getting like warning bells here, because you're like, well, was Jesus wrong? I thought this Bible is inerrant, and if Jesus is God, how could he make a mistake? Ahimelech was actually the father of Abiathar, but most conservative scholars tend to think that Abiathar was better known, simply because his term as high priest happened during a more high-profile era in the history of Israel. So what Jesus is doing here, they think, is referring to the more popular of these two who would be more likely to be remembered. It's like saying, you know, remember back when man landed on the moon? So it's kind of a general reference. And then the other thing that critics point out here, that at this point right here, and also gave to those who were with him. So David eats the bread, and then in Jesus' account, he shares it with his disciples. In the account in 1 Samuel 21, David doesn't actually share it with anyone. In fact, David goes into the temple alone. This is one of those examples of Jesus either expanding on the story. He's God, he knows what happened. The author of 1 Samuel just didn't include that David's guys were waiting outside. David went in, he got the showbread, he brought it out, and once he had brought it out, he shared it with them. If you're going to be a stickler for the rules here, it seems like Jesus is mistaken. Okay, so he's either mistaken, which theologically for us as Christians doesn't work. He's God in a body, he knows everything that is. He would know to get these details right. He wouldn't be limited by the textual record that he would have had access to as a man living in Israel at the time. Or maybe in his self-limiting, in his incarnation, he would have. This is really beyond the scope of this discussion. But what I like about this is that he's not really sweating the details. Okay, why? Well, to me it seems like he's not sweating the details because he's concerned about the heart of the matter. For you and I, I'll get to proving that in just a second here, but for you and I, the point is clear. Don't sweat the details so much that you miss the heart of the matter. Here's the whole point. It's in verse 27. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man. So the Sabbath, which is in question, was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Now this is also interesting here, this word, which we'll get to in just a second. In the Greek, it's really cool. It says the Sabbath was made through man, not man through the Sabbath. And then because Jesus refers to himself here as the Son of Man, the word for man here in the Greek is anthropos, which is human. Obviously we know Jesus isn't human, he's God in a body, he's fully God and fully man. But I wonder if he's making a play on words here. I think he probably is, simply because of this word through, right? Because it's clear that you and I didn't make the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath was something that God instituted. So the surface level here is the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the idea being that the rules are meant to serve you, not you the rules. Put another way, the rules are meant to draw you into a relationship with God. They're meant to give you space for relationship with God, not the other way around. But I also like the possible interpretation here that Jesus is playing with them a little bit, saying the Sabbath was made through the human, not the human for the Sabbath. And when he calls himself the Son of Man, the same word for man is used here, here, and here. So it's possible that he's building a case here for his authority, which really is the thing that's in play throughout all of these sections that we've been studying the last few weeks. This word here, therefore, in the Greek is besides, which is great. Helps me. It's like either way, okay, whether this flight of fancy in terms of the poetic interpretation is true or not, or whether he's just being blunt and direct, either way, besides, he says, the Son of Man, me, Jesus, I am Lord, which in the Greek is master. I am master of the Sabbath. So, my friends, you Pharisees, you religious church people, if you are sweating the jots and tittles of the law, you're missing the point. And the point is this: Jesus is saying, look, they're walking with me. They're all right. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I'm not offended by what they're doing. The point for us is clear. Keep walking with Jesus, and you, my friend, are also going to be just fine. God bless you. We'll see you next week.